This first presentation is really just a summary of what you would have got in the briefing before this, and outline some key issues really around adversity and what we know about childhood adversity, and obviously the impact that can have on a whole range of psychosocial outcomes for young people, and its specific relationship with violence and the harm that that causes, both the increased vulnerabilities of young people and increase the harms that emerge out of it, and the whole area of mental health, and the suppose the bi-directional influence of mental health outcome, and also externalizing difficulties and aggression and violence. But also that there's some opportunities here, and there's a lot we can glean from evidence, both internationally and in the context of NI, around what works to try to identify young people who are most vulnerable, who are most at risk both of victimization and perpetration, and then I suppose a summary of what we know, within the next 10 minutes or so, what we know in terms of what does the evidence tell us, both using administrative data and some empirical data and research that myself and other colleagues have been involved in. And then Mickey McKenna will follow on, Mickey from Youth Action, who has been involved, Youth Action certainly, for a number of decades. Don't want to say Mickey's been involved for a number of decades and give away your age, Mickey, but in really innovative work stretching back to the late 90s, early noughties, and working with young men and capturing the voices of young men, and particular themes of mental health and violence. And he can maybe say something about that. And with a clip from young men themselves, to capture very quickly what it is they're saying. And then Una, I think, Una is there, and Una is leading on a very innovative project in the Northwest around connecting youth services within the health system, with a specific focus on reducing harm, reducing vulnerability, and capturing young people, I suppose, at opportune moments, teachable moments as they're called, within the health system, and specifically within emergency departments. So that's very new, very novel. It's also evidence informed. It's been implemented elsewhere internationally, and so Una can speak briefly to that and what's going on there. So look, I'm just going to run through some of the key things that you would have read in your briefing, and most of you will be familiar with this. And if you're not familiar with the instrument itself, you'll be familiar with the research that came out of Vincent Folletti's kind of, I suppose, seminal research around adverse childhood experiences. And you'll be familiar with at least some of the key findings that come out of that. It was seminal in the sense that it was the first time that there was a systematic capture of the prevalence of childhood adversity across the life course, and also the impact across a whole range of areas of life across the life course. And so what Folletti and his team were able to describe pretty much for the first time in a way that was able to be communicated to a very large population was that these adversities, both singly and in multiples, had a pretty profound impact. And whenever he tracked these the associations between adversity and outcomes across thousands of people, and they were able to find a correlation and an association between adversity and a whole range of psychosocial outcomes, morbidity, comorbidity, and ultimately increased rates of mortality, kind of illustrating the really significant impact of early childhood experiences. So it was a very important piece of research. It was seminal in the sense that it for the first time captured how prevalent actually adversity was. I think there was always an understanding that difficult life events, difficult experiences during childhood, and actually at any time, increased risks of negative outcomes. But the sheer scale of it, I suppose, before Folletti's research was pretty much unknown. But it wasn't the first, but we kind of know, and anybody working in the area of particularly violence prevention, in social care and social work, working in the communities where we know the impact of deprivation and poverty and maltreatment in the home and exposure to violence in the community, all these things have a big impact on young people. But what it also did, there were challenges with that initially study. I don't want to dwell too much on the point because I know a lot has been done in NI over the last couple of years around ACEs, but there are some challenges with it in the sense that it failed to recognise the different types of adversities that young people were exposed to. There seemed to be an emphasis on childhood adversity pretty much in the home, without recognising some of the adversities that young people experience in the community as well as in the home. It also placed an emphasis on suppose that this threshold of 4+. So if you were exposed to 4 or more ACEs, as they're called, then you were at X% risk of addiction, of developing mental health issue, of being unemployed, which in some ways at a population level there was an association, but at the same time it inferred an equivalency in adversity, which we know from the wider trauma research, actually different types of adversity result in different outcomes. So some will result in increased levels of psychological distress and a whole range of psychosocial behavioural outcomes, while others won't. And we also know that young people, bridging adversity and what we know about young people developmentally, is that adversity is kind of age graded, in the sense that they're more likely to be exposed to different types of adversity at different points in their lives. And importantly, in the conversation around violence, we know that boys and girls, even when they're exposed to the same types of adversity, i.e. violence, they're likely to develop different responses to that. So for instance, we know that during early childhood, boys and girls are at equal risk of being exposed to violence in the home and maltreatment. But as young people develop, as they grow, as they're much more mobile in the community, and they progress into early adolescence, late adolescence, the risks that our boys and girls, young men, young women are exposed to differ significantly. So young men are much more likely to be victims of violence in the community, peer-related violence, school-related violence, and we know in the context of Northern Ireland, paramilitary-related violence. And I can show you some figures for what we're starting to learn about that. At an international level, and I thought this was important to flag up as a baseline, we know that around 60% of young people are exposed to some sort of violence. A recent report by the World Health Organization in their regional report on violence found that 55 million across the EU will experience violence in their lifetime. And we know that this is elevated in conflict settings, so this is particularly pronounced in NI. And we can see that from a recent report that Lisa Bunting and other colleagues in Queen's done in the first, I suppose, the first prevalence study of adversity in Northern Ireland, published late last year, and they found that violence was the most commonly experienced type of trauma for young people in Northern Ireland. And so why is this important? Well, we know that the consequences of violence are huge. We know that they're huge for the victim. We also know that they're huge for the perpetrator. And we also know that actually that distinction between victim and perpetrator is sometimes skewed by the fact that they overlap quite a lot of time. We know that there's economic costs. We know that there's costs associated with treating physical injury, but we also know that there's significant costs and probably more enduring costs associated with a whole range of psychological disorders and clinically diagnosable disorders, particularly the likes of post-traumatic stress and co-occurring mental health issues like anxiety and depression. And so what do we know about the link between violence and the onset of mental health difficulties? Well, I suppose we would expect that young people who are direct victims would develop these mental health difficulties. And we know that they're much more significant risk of developing post-traumatic stress, characterized in terms of externalizing difficulties, so aggressive behavior and violence, and also internalizing difficulties, anxiety and depression. But actually, a lot of the more contemporary research is showing that whether you're the direct victim of violence, or whether you witness it, or whether you're threatened, they all have a significant impact on your mental health outcomes. So there's some estimates that between 2.5, that whether you're directly victimized or whether you're kind of indirectly exposed to violence, maybe from living in a violent community, you're between 2.5 to 3 times greater risk of perpetrating violence yourself. Again, illustrating that link between victimization and perpetration. But also we have to bear in mind that one of the key points across violence research is that not all victims are going to perpetrate, and we know that. We're talking about a small group. So what is it that connects the victim to the perpetrator? What is it about trauma responses that are much more likely to lead to perpetration of violence? Well, I suppose if we think about violence and what that actually means, it's different from other types of trauma in the sense that the perpetrator of violence, the person who's victimizing you, has purposely set out to victimize you. And if we put that in the context of a family setting, it's somebody who is supposed to love you, is supposed to care about you. In the community, you know, a community that is supposed to be safe for you to live in. And so part of the reason for the onset of psychological distress is how people come to terms with understanding why this victimization is taking place, and why was it that somebody, whoever it was, a stranger or somebody known to them, has purposely set out to harm. And what goes on in the moments kind of immediately after the victimization, immediately after the potential trauma, are kind of called peri-trauma factors. And one of the peri-trauma factors that are predictive of increased distress is social support. So in the absence of social support, people to help you make sense of what has went on and recover, we know that the rates of PTSD are much more significant, and we know that the externalizing difficulties and internalizing difficulties are much higher as well. But we also know that gender plays a significant part, and that relationship hasn't been well established or well kind of worked out what the mechanism that links the two. But what we do know is that even with the same risks, even with the same type of exposure, there's something about the influence of gender that mediates different effects. So we can see violence both as a cause of psychological trauma, and we can also see it as an effect of psychological trauma. And that's not just a conceptual way to frame it. We know that, for instance, in work that has taken place within youth justice, Dr. Kay was involved in a piece of research with myself, and we looked at what sort of adversities did young people within the custodial system be exposed to in the home, in the community, the different level, the kind of indicators of distress that they were experiencing. And we found that young people with violent convictions were 9 times more likely to have been a victim of violence themselves. So this is pretty strong evidence that supports what has been known, I suppose, elsewhere and illustrated elsewhere, of this overlap between victimization, perpetration, and something that mediates it around both gender and the onset of psychological distress. But there's opportunities, and we know that where systems have come together to coordinate a response, both to understand the prevalence of violence, understand the harm that it causes, and implement evidence-based responses to reduce both incidents and harm. They have significant impacts on reducing both of those things. And one of the most replicable, I suppose, approaches is the public health approach. And 4 pretty logical steps are involved in that. So surveillance is essentially about like, what's going on, how do we know how big the problem is, where it is, who's most effective. And through that data collection, we can identify key risk factors and protective factors that then inform delivery and practice responses underpinned by coordinated policy. And then obviously those activities are implemented and the effects are evaluated. Was it successful, and did it do what it was supposed to do? But this is kind of where we've been at for a number of years in NI. You know, how much do we know about what's going on, and to what extent have we identified what's potentially useful for young people in reducing harm, in reducing vulnerability, and ultimately reducing incidents of violence and exposure to violence. So I'll just give you very quickly, how am I for time? Still okay? Good. Okay, so part of the public health approach is drawing on evidence from a number of different sectors, so justice, health, education, youth service, and wherever data can be gleaned. So I'll just give you a very quick overview of, kind of suppose, the state of evidence just now. So using police data is very, very useful in terms of monitoring, gives us an indication of incidents and trends over time, and we can see that the violence against the person trends have been on a kind of upward trajectory pretty much from 2012, albeit that you would kind of expect around a 4% decrease since the onset of COVID, but indicators that might increase significantly as we kind of emerge out of COVID. In terms of security related statistics that are widely available as well, we can see that on average there continues to be 70 assaults and 49 shootings per year. And similarly, there seems to be something around the 2012-2013 period that has led to an increase in how this data is collected. Visually, and sometimes these visuals are more useful than numbers. this is a visual of a 1-year period of all incidents of violence reported to again, using police data, and gives you just an indication both of concentration but also coverage, that we can see very clearly that violence isn't something that happens in particular communities. If we take out Lough Neagh and we take out the more mountainous and more rural areas of NI, you can see that pretty much every community is affected in some way by violence. And then if we look at pre-COVID, post-COVID kind of comparisons, we can see in the first graphic on the top that, again, quite significant coverage, concentrations in the areas that you would expect. So the bigger cities, Derry and Belfast. But if you look below, and this is the top one is February 20, and then the bottom's February 21, just to look at a kind of period pre and post. You can see similar concentrations, but actually you can see that the rates appear to be growing and extending out beyond those larger cities. Again, maybe an indicator of an escalation, but we'd need to look at the trends more widely. Formal education systems, maybe not a place you would automatically think of an indicator of trends and balance, but suspension records are a useful metric in understanding what's going on within the formal education system. So we know from 11, 12, and prior to COVID, obviously there's it would have been difficult to make comparisons, I suppose, given the way education unfolded over the last year or so. But prior to COVID, you're talking over 27,000 young people were suspended, and 15,000 of those were violence related, which is around 57% of the total, average over 2,000 young people a year, and 82% young men, which probably is comparable with the rates that you would see within the justice system. And then within the non-formal education system, within youth services within the community sector, we can look at a timeline and I suppose an interest over a number of years, a number of decades, around trying to unpack what does it mean for young people living in communities, what's their relationship with violence, what's the exposure. 2001 Youth Action published a seminal report called Everyday Life that really captured the experience of young men living in communities, and pretty much they were saying, like, this is just something we live with. It's actually not, it's so normal that we don't even think about it. And that led to, I suppose, an emphasis and an interest in how do we engage with young men to challenge some of these norms, challenge some of these expectations, but also support them in some of the things that they've been exposed to. Then the Belfast Youth Development Study in 2009 estimated that within that cohort, 77% had a lifetime exposure to violence. The reason I point that out is, if you remember, that there was an estimate of 60% lifetime exposure internationally, which gives you an idea that there's some indication that there are more elevated rates in Northern Ireland. Then the Centre for Young Men Studies was established in Ulster. Ken Harlan, Sam McCready co-directed on that. And over a longitudinal study, they found that 75% of young men reported not just lifetime exposure, frequent exposure, which goes slightly further than the Belfast Youth Development Study, frequent exposure to violence in communities. Then 2019, myself and a colleague, Dirk Shabutz from Queen's, followed up on some of the work that had been done with, previously building on the work through Youth Action and also the Centre for Young Men Studies. Say, look, what's the state of play now? 2001 was just about post Good Friday Agreement, that watershed moment in NI. When with 2019, what do we know now? What's the experience of young men? What we found was that it was still highly prevalent. Young people's exposure to violence was still very common, but actually it was very nuanced as well. So it wasn't the same type of exposure, depending on if you spoke to young men in Derry, Belfast, Armagh, but actually the different types of exposure depended on where they were from. And then a significant investment by the Education Authority around embedding really robust evaluation mechanisms and research methods into what it is they're doing in terms of their targeted youth responses, targeted youth delivery, is starting to build on a lot of this other descriptive work. So it's not just about exposure, it's also about what are the factors that link exposure to the negative outcomes that we see. So through some of these, through EA's work, we're starting to see it's not just 70%, 80%, we're finding that young people engaged in that targeted delivery, almost all of them have some exposure to violence, but also that there's a link between violence and elevated psychological distress that's been measured. 50% going through these programs are saying that they feel unsafe. And also we're seeing that they're not just exposed to violence in one place and one setting, but also across a whole number of domains in the school, in the home, and in the community, and also strong associations between young people who are living in particular communities and being exposed to really significant higher harm violence, essentially through paramilitary attacks and threats. And the final piece, so that's actually just been written up at the minute, is a piece of research looking at the riots and interviewing young people who were involved in some of the activities early April, and to try to understand, like, what are the push and the pull factors? Why are some young people engaged in this type of violence while others are able to maintain some kind of degree of safety and avoid that? And just throw up, you'll see why I mentioned that in a second, but these are some of the comments made by young people as part of that study, and it's still being written up. Myself and another colleague, Shad Marina, are involved in that, but thought these comments from young people were useful for today. So one young people saying, just knowing you could be walking up a street, walking up an alley, they could come out and they could beat you. This idea that you could be next, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be actively involved in any particular activity or be known to any particular person. They're well aware that there's kind of cases of what's considered mistaken identity, which both suggest a degree of legitimacy of what's going on, but also a normalization that this is, you kind of live with this risk in communities day in, day out. But there's also an issue of support and service, and I suppose how restricted young people feel to talk about the issues that are going on in the area, particularly when it comes to contentious issues around paramilitaries and paramilitary threat, coercion, and very much a culture of silence that's just accepted in some of these areas. So there's no services, and even if there were services, they would be reluctant to engage with them because of how that might seem and be perceived within the local community. So if they're under threat, even, this young man was saying that, even if you're under threat, unless it's really a case of a case of mortality and a very significant threat that you could ultimately be killed, you're not going to go near anybody. You just take it, because if you speak to anybody, the community will see you as ABC, and also it will make things 10 times worse. So I think you were saying, look, actually you could end up getting several beatings if you spoke to anybody. So that this idea of a culture, or at least a perspective, that sustains this coercion that goes on in some of these areas. And then we come to health, and what do we know about health? Well, World Health Organization said that in the context of violence prevention, health has a duty to prevent death and morbidity. It's actually got really significant interest in doing this, simply because at the front line, the health are treating victims because of their physical injury, and over the longer term, they're going to be treating psychological distress. And they're uniquely situated to capture relevant data. So what's the state of play in Northern Ireland? Well, actually, there's no consistent way of measuring or capturing violence-related data across the health system. There is an NHS protocol. I've listed it there just in case you want to look, Google it or have a look at it. But that is there, and it's basically saying there's a minimum standard for the collection of violence-related data within emergency departments, but that's not happening. But it's important that I suppose we were able to capture in some way what is going on within the health system to complement what we know from elsewhere, the education system, youth service, community, and policing. Sutherland earlier this year reviewed 40,000 ambulance service cases and found that 90% had no corresponding case in the police data set. So it kind of illustrates, if we rely solely on police data, we're missing a big part of the picture. And if we're serious about the public health approach and an evidence-based approach, both to improving outcomes and reducing vulnerabilities for young people, the health element is pretty significant in informing. So the key points, I suppose, I'll just finish with. We've come to understand the impact of adversity. I think everybody in the room will be familiar with that. We also come to appreciate that not all adversity is experienced equally, either by individuals or communities. The impact also is not universal. So even two people who experience the similar kind of event are not going to have the same response. Violence itself is a particularly pervasive form of adversity, and it disproportionately affects young people, particularly young men. Coordinated responses have shown significant promise, and through reliable data collection that's shared across systems, coordinated responses, these are all kind of critical ingredients. This is the recipe for improving the lives of young people and reducing harm and reducing vulnerability. So I'll leave with these two quotes from people who've been involved in this for a number of years. Essentially, violence can be prevented. You know, it's not an article of faith, but a statement of fact. And if we have it, and this is the challenge, if we kind of accept that first statement that it can be prevented, and we're not doing it, and we're not joining up services, and we're not coordinating things across systems, and we're not invested in understanding who's most at risk and how do we protect and support them, then why not? And what are we doing about that? So I'll stop sharing my screen there.
Thanks very much, Colin. So we've, I think that that's provided a really good context, actually, you know, for the discussions later, and some things I think we definitely want to pick up on.
So my name's Stephen Quigley from the Education Authority Youth Service, and my colleague line manages the staff on this programme. My role is advisor for outreach services, and as part of that, there's three key projects that I have oversight of. The first one is a Tackling Paramilitarism programme, within which we have around 6 projects that have been funded by the Paramilitarism Programme Board. If we want to those projects in more detail on another day, but for today I'm going to focus on one of the 6, which is Connect. I also lead out on the REACH programme, which is an emotional health and wellbeing programme for young people in primary and post-primary schools, and as the EA's Youth Services response to the emotional health and wellbeing framework for young people in education. And the third project is FLARE, which is the same kind of project that's based in the community and based in working with young people outside of school hours. So there's a bit of a connect between them all, and I hope we'll see that as we go through. So Connect, the aims of the Connect programme is to complement the work of medical staff in emergency departments by engaging with patients who have been affected by violence. Is to stop the revolving door of young people with violent injury presenting to emergency departments, and to support young people up to the age of 25 to move away from violence. So why do we want to work in emergency departments? Why are youth workers and youth services putting themselves in that space, which is not a space that we're very familiar with? First of all, what we found is in the research that Colin provided us with about 2 years ago was that when young people arrive at an emergency department, it's a time when they can reevaluate their life. It can often be a very low point on what's called a reachable or teachable moment to engage with young people. As youth workers, we want to be there for young people when they need us most. And what this research showed us is they need us most, and we can have impact most if we are there in the emergency department when they present themselves. Youth workers also have quite a unique role in the lives of young people in that they volunteer to share their time with us. They volunteer to engage with us. They're not ordered to be there. What that means is we often act as advocates and connects for them, and can connect them through with individuals and others in their community. And similar programs have shown that additional support of a youth worker during particularly traumatic times means that relationships can be developed, which means that young people are less likely to continue to attend A&E as a result of violence. So working in emergency departments, we have to remind people and remind ourselves what is youth work. We are not medical staff, we are not doctors, we're not nurses, we're not psychologists, we are youth workers. And youth work is a strength-based approach to engaging young people. We work with young people to develop their personal, social, developmental and educational outcomes. And as I just mentioned, young people choose to be involved, they voluntarily participate in our service. And youth work starts with a young person's at, not where we would like them to be, but where they're at. So the Connect programme adult in Galvin, there's currently 2 full-time professionally qualified youth workers working in Connect. The first weekend we started was the 21st of May 2021, about 1.5 years later than what we hoped, but COVID interrupted. So it was a bit of a long journey to get there from initial thoughts and ideas to actually getting the youth workers on the ground. The four part-time youth workers are currently going through the recruitment process. We are on site Friday and Saturday night from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. So we do the overnight shifts Friday and Saturday night. That was based on a scoping exercise that was completed with Derry City and Stavanger District Council's PCSP, which basically showed us what we would imagine the majority of young people who present the EDs with as a result of violence tend to do so on Friday and Saturday nights. So that's when we need to be there when they need us most. And then the youth workers work off-site from Tuesday to Friday, doing follow-up work in the community with young people who have chose to access the service. In Scotland, it's called a Navigator programme, but in this programme, we decided to call it Connect. We call it the Connect because we have a lot of other services out there that are funded through EA Youth Services and other funders that are there to support young people. And by connecting with those services, we feel we can have a bit of a wraparound with them and be there for them whenever Connect can't, but all our services can. We have a street-based youth work team in Derry City Centre that works Thursday, Friday, Saturday and Sunday night. So a lot of the young people who present the ED are young people who are involved with our street-based team. Sorry, I just skipped a slide there. We have a city centre drop-in called Our Space, which is open at night and weekends. Thanks to the Tackling Parallelism programme team, who fund this programme. We also have engaged youth workers who are working with young people who are under the influence or potentially about to come under the influence of paramilitary organisations. We have emotional health and wellbeing programme teams on the ground, and we also have our youth centres, which tend to be large facilities in the most in the communities that need the most. The slide shows acting funny on me. So partners, as I mentioned, the programme is funded by the Tackling Parallelism programme. We have been working very closely with the emergency department, who have really been so enthusiastic about us being there, have done everything they can to make us feel welcome and to embed us under their service and get to know how they work. The PSNI, Gordy's in the meeting today, and Gordy was in the original group who put together this proposal when he was in Derry City and Strabane. So we work quite closely with the PSNI on this project. We know the officers who come to the hospital and we engage with them when they bring young people there. Colin Walsh from Queen's University Belfast has been working with us to design our BIS line of young people's needs when they attend, and how we can measure the impact of the service over 3 and 6 months to see if we are having an impact. And also Northwest Youth Services, which is a collection of voluntary sector youth clubs in the Derry and Strabane area, who've been working closely with us to ensure that they are there as a referral partner for young people coming out the other side. So basically the role of the worker, I have about a minute left, is to be present in A&E when young people need us most, to develop relationships, to support the emergency department staff, and to ideally work with young people so that they are not continually coming back to emergency departments as victims of violence. So we've been on site for about 8 nights in total now, maybe 9 nights in total. And on those 9 nights, 16 young people have received support from the Connect youth workers. Of those 16, hope 7 and 9 makes 16 now, I haven't counted that wrong. So of the 16, 7 young people we were able to support in the emergency department while they were there, and that's all the support they chose to have. And of the 16, a further 9 have agreed to continue to receive support ongoing throughout the week from the youth workers. The main presenting issues, and they're often not isolated, they're often overlapping, are mental health issues, alcohol, drugs, and violence. And what we found, and 2 or 3 young people who have suffered accidents, but through our support with them, we've identified all our vulnerabilities that we can help them with. So moving forward, we want to develop the approach in all our emergency departments across the north. We want to develop an on-call system for young people who are victims of criminal gang attacks. Criminal gang attacks don't happen on a particular date, on a particular night, at a particular time. We can't be in the emergency departments all the time, so we're working with Una and Ryan Smith in Altnagalvin to have an on-call system. So if someone presents at a Wednesday morning at 11 o'clock as a victim of a criminal gang attack, that we'll have a youth worker on call who can go to the emergency department and be there with them. And we're also looking at a potential linkage with the phone first service, where we're encouraging people to phone the ED first to ascertain if they should attend, and if we can support them even if they don't attend the department. So that's just a whistle-stop tour of Connect, which came into being on the 21st of May.
That's a really interesting project, Stephen, you know, and particularly given in light of what Colin has said about the increasing focus on trauma as a public health issue as well and violence. So it's a great example of interdisciplinary work, which hopefully will feature in discussion as well. So just one more presentation then from Michael McKenna from Youth Action, and Michael heads up the young men's work in Youth Action.
Thanks. Colin, have you the wee video there?
Yeah, we'll see if we can.
Yeah, Colin's just going to,
Do,
this is just
do,
some,
do, do you want me to play that now, Margaret?
yeah, just play that now. This is just a group of young men we've working with, and this is just their views on the theme of violence. There you go, Colin, thanks.
It's difficult, in my opinion, for young men today because they're always having a misperception of being violent and aggressive and argumentative, and people just build this bad persona of what a young man is.
Violence doesn't really impact me too much. See, me and my friends might have a bit of messing about, like slapsies on the head, and just messing about, but violence, it's not really like my thing. I wouldn't go around asking for a fight.
So like violence is a main subject these days for young boys, especially like on nights out. For example, if the boy is in straight or is from a different country and you meet a bad group of boys, they will start on you for being different religion, different nationality, or like different sexuality. Like you can't feel always safe going out and trying to have fun with your mates. Like
that, like whenever you hear like on like social media about like say like someone's like throwing bottles or like just starting trouble or starting fights, you instantly think it's a boy instead of like a group of girls. And even though like girls, I've seen them do just the same, but they never get the blame. It's always straight to the boys, straight to young men.
Young men use violence as a way to get rid of their stress, and I feel as if they use it as a way to show their dominance in front of females.
Well, violence impacts my life, but also impacts like everyone, because there's little campaigns like One Punch Can Kill, like on nights out and stuff like that. You see people just give, especially in young men, it's more common because they just give each other a look and to just fight over nothing. It's silly stuff, and I don't realise the like repercussions that can actually have. They can actually kill someone just by one punch.
Violence relates to young men on a very negative way. A lot of young men feel like they need to go out on nights out and fight and try to prove a point that they're like very masculine and whatnot, whereas I myself, I think that violence isn't overly important. I try to avoid it at all costs. I'd rather just speak about any issues, and I think it's a way better to resolve issues using communication rather than fights and stuff.
Thanks for that, Colin. I suppose I thought it was important as part of this meeting. We actually brought the voice of young men, you know, directly to the heart of the conversation because of the role that violence plays within their life. That actual video that was actually taken for the first time we were going to deliver this. I was going to make a new one with a group of young men, but when I watched that back again and actually looked at it, I thought to myself, the messages that are coming across over a year ago are still they're the same as what young men are telling us, you know, today. And I could take this right back to 2001 to Youth Action's Everyday Life project, where young men are telling us that, you know, violence has become very normal. You know, for them, it's very normal as part of their everyday life because the message is still there. Even that young man that was talking in that video in the blue tab about violence is not something that he goes looking for, and it doesn't impact him. You know, but he plays, you know, him and his friends play slapsies. I can tell you now that I have conversations with young men where similar activities that they do has turned into violence, has turned into fights, has turned into falling out, but you know, physically turning into violence. So the fact that he sees a game of slapsies as something that's not even, you know, linked with violence, for me really reinforces that notion that, you know, for young men, you know, violence is there. They see it at every opportunity. They see it at every turnaround within their lives. So it's there, and it's something that we need to address as well. So I was going to share. I have a wee short presentation as well. If I can just share my screen, is that okay? Just sort of I'll flick through this sort of, you know, as quickly as I can. again, as I said there about, it's important for us that young men's voices is brought to this. And the work that Youth Action will be doing with young men over a number of years, as Colin says, from the early to mid 90s, sort of right through to present day, has been very much about that working with young men on a preventative sort of model as well. But this is what young men have told us that are involved in our programs. I feel that I've learned to communicate with my peers and got to know them. I've got to know people in other organisations. In violent situations, I would think about them more now than I would have before. And I think that for me actually shows that by actually addressing the issue with young men, to start to think about the consequences of their actions on what they get involved in. Just for anybody who doesn't know Youth Action, we're a membership-based charity, and we've been working with young people over 75 years. And our vision is that young people are happy, and hopeful. And we've got offices right across sort of Northern Ireland as well. That's just a wee quote from some young men we're working with. We've got them involved in Pilates to try and take a wee bit of, give them an opportunity to participate in something different. And that's just a wee quote from a young man who'd never done Pilates before, so it's a first for me. He never thought he would do it, but it's, for him, he found it very relaxing. I think that there's about taking opportunities to explore other ways of working with young men as well. Within our sort of the work with young men team within Youth Action, what we say is that we want to sort of work with young men and others to develop and implement strategy to work with them, where they can actually sort of develop alternatives and alternatives to sort of outdated and restrictive masculinities and this notion about what society perceives as what it means to be male, and actually get young men to take some time to explore that. In the Centre for Young Men Studies, Colin mentioned earlier on, but Youth Action were pivotal in the Centre for Young Men Studies research as well. We were in the case study schools delivering youth work approaches with young men to sort of, and this was captured in the report as well. But recommendation number 4 says that boys should explore, reflect, and develop a critical understanding of masculinity and masculinities, as we know now, because there is also multiple identities and there's multiple levels of masculinity as well. So we need to actually learn to explore them as well. And with this, then should be encouraged to challenge that sort of them stereotypical notions of what masculinity is and the negative impact that can have upon them, themselves and others. And the young men that we've been working with in that wee video, some of them are sort of, they're talking about that as well. So our approach to the work as well is, and there's lots of different models, for this as well, but sort of we would see our approach as being a very practical sort of, very much a practical approach to engaging young men sort of around these things. And what we're saying there's that is knowledge of masculinity and masculinities, and that there's obviously for workers and for the young men, themselves. And, we get a clearer understanding of the issues that impact, on young men whenever we spend time talking, listening to them, and engaging them on these issues. And we would sort of we would find that rather than sort of try and find ways to control young men, that when we take the time to listen, to respond to their needs, what their concerns are, what their needs are, we find that they respond better to that as well. Again, knowledge of issues affecting young men, that there sort of gets us right back down to sort of what's happening in the local issues as well. We believe that their attitudes and their expectations around masculinity and masculinities plays a significant role, in how they live their lives, how they see themselves, how they see the world around them as well. And they've got their own issues that they're dealing with, as well. And we need to understand that when young men are coming through the door, to the sessions that we're delivering, is that they could have something happen in their house, in their community, in their school today that's really impacted them. So we need to know the young men, and we need to take time to do that as well. We also talk about making yourself vulnerable, and this is for all workers, but particularly for us, for male workers as well, because it can be doing this work with young men can be a personal challenge. As male workers, we need to find ways of actually, stepping outside this sort of stereotypical role of what it is to be male, and that's where that sense of vulnerability comes from as well. So we need to think about that, and with workers and staff and people we're working with, they took the time to explore masculinity and masculinities and what that sort of means, for them as well. So we need to take time to do that, and time to to understand it, because we would bring back, young men's behaviour, right back to sort of how they see themselves as men and masculinities. And a lot of the time when we work with young men, what they tell us is, people tell them why they're behaving in a certain way, why they're violent, without actually sort of asking them, well, why did you do that? And young men tell us that on a regular basis, is that they're actually told. So, we need to take a time. Well, we might be listening to them. We actually need to hear what they're actually saying. Talk about creating, safe environments. And again, this is back to sort of, we work on that understanding of the vulnerability of young men as well. And, that coming into these sort of, into these group work settings for some young men is that, they're coming in maybe in contrary to this notion of this hardness, and this, the hard man image that some young men are having. It's beginning to sort of look at that vulnerability and what is it, why are they behaving, in a certain way as well. And, and then getting them to think about, how can they do things differently in their own lives. As some of the young men were saying, the young man at the very end there was talking about, when he's thinking about violent situations, he started to think about how we could get out of it and, begin to deal with it in a different way as well. So it's beginning to sort of create them environments where them conversations and that, them conversations, and they are challenging and they are hard for some young men as well, that they can actually start to do that. Sorry, I've just missed a screen there. Again, just another quote from a young man, just basically saying that the project was about them, their development as men, and it shows that no matter who they are, build, size, sexuality, and you don't have to be that stereotypical sort of male. It made them more aware of our actions. For example, they took part in the PSNA program, One Punch Can't Kill, and that there's other ways of sorting the issues out as well. So they were, consciously starting to think about how they could live their lives differently. I think Stephen touched on this as well, about just meeting young men, where they're at, and this also sort of like, for us, is like, going out onto, to meet the young men where they're at as well. But it's also meeting young men, where they are within themselves at that particular time, where their mind is and what their thinking is. So, their language that they're coming in with, there could be sectarianism, it could be, sectarian, there could be sexist, it could be racist. But if we don't start working with these young men, where they're at, we're not going to be able to change, their opinion. So we need to sort of do that both in that physical sense and where they're at, within themselves as well. We also talk about making programs, relevant to the lives of young men. And we heard this continuously in the Centre for Young Men Studies research, where when young men were talking about, in the formal education and the schools and the subjects that they were learning in school, they were saying, why am I learning about this? Why am I learning about Macbeth? Teach me to read, teach me to write, teach me to count. Why am I learning all these other things? So we're trying to sort of work with young men about, the relevance of formal education, subjects within their school, but also within their own community. What is it? A program that, for example, Stevie's running down in St. Peter's there. There could be similarities to what's running, in rural South Armagh, but there's also going to be difference, and there's always going to be difference about how we do that. But make it about their lives, make it about them. Spend time, talking to them about the issues, that it is. So when we're working with the young men about, around about the theme of violence, we're talking about stuff. Hence, then we were able to think about, right, we need to get the PSNA in here to do something about the One Punch Can Kill and talk about laws and stuff as well, and bring that into it as well. And the young men are very receptive, to that as well. And we also talk about offering, skills development and leadership opportunities. Bring young men in as volunteers. We want more positive male role models in communities. We want young men that other young men can aspire to be. So we would use quite a lot of young men in that role as young male volunteers, and we train them up. But again, it's a journey for them too. We are working, with them around stuff as well. We had a wee celebration event, funny enough, with a group of young people at the weekend. Some young men was there, and the conversations were sort of going, these are young people that have come through a journey with us as well, and we've explored some of this stuff. And they were getting back to this normalised violence. Oh, there was a fight the other night, which happens here, we'll go in and fire you slaps as well. And we actually brought them back to sort of say, well, look, you need to think about what you're saying here. Violence isn't the answer, but we worked with this as well. So getting them to think about them as well, but it's a journey as well. And then the last thing, sort of briefly, there is bring the local community on the journey, with you as well. So that's about involving members, of the local communities that we're working with as well, because if they can understand young men and understand masculinity and masculinities and understand that violence thing as well, it's actually going to benefit, because there's more people then are aware of what's going on. There's more people have got an interest in the lives of young men. There's more people thinking about, well, if there's violence sort of issues going on in our community, what do we need to do with young men to address it as well? So that's as much as I'm going to say. I just kept it short and sweet, because the young men, for me, that video really sums up the conversation on what we need to do and where we need to go to with this conversation as well. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Michael. I think it was very useful too, the things you said around the need to reflect on the broader societal issues and views of masculinity and so on. I think that is really important.